right, so we've had a little biography of Herman Melville. We've gone over some of the things, the issues that were happening in the country at the time. So as you read the story, you want to really go deep. You want to not just be surface level on why is Bartleby so bizarre? I just what's going on? I mean that's part of experiencing the story, but you want to go deep in that you want to think if you think of this society, well, if you want to think of what's going on in the society at the time, sorry, and you then think of the story, well, what's happening here? So is can you be an individual within a society? Can you just be your unique self? Or is that problematic? Does society try to fit you into a mold? Does society and the individuals that comprise our society try to force you into conforming? So, in self-reliance, Emerson talks about being a nonconformist and how important it is to be a nonconformist. But can you really do that? Or do you have to, on some level, conform to the norms of society? I think Melville is playing with that idea throughout. And if you think of that aspect of it, of the story, it takes you to a deeper level. And then the story starts to make sense more. And it becomes, I think, more meaningful. The other thing to think of is that Melville was trying to do something different in his writing. Remember, he'd been successful with his sea stories, but when he tried to do something different, the publishers weren't really accepting, didn't want his different ideas, and the public was perplexed by this story particularly. So he's trying to do something different, and was that really accepted? Was he able to be successful as a writer when he tried to really do something different, really, be an individual in this regard? He could do it, but he wasn't necessarily successful with it. So I think he is really sort of playing with how far can you go in being an individual and how much do you need to really conform to the norms of society. If you think of the story on this level, then it just takes on a deeper meaning. And so for example, I mentioned the transcendentalist. So I mentioned Bronson Alcott, right? And I had mentioned that he started this transcendentalist community called Fruitlands. So he started this community, and again, they would not wear cotton. They also did not use whale oil, which was very common at the time. So they had to find an alternative to that because they did not want to harm the whales. They were really ahead of their time. And they did not eat any meat. It was actually vegan, and really there were none of the products that you would think of today associated with being a vegetarian or vegan. So it was it was a lot of sacrifice. So it was a great vision that he had to do this intentional transcendentalist community. But there's a lot that went awry. They were going to have this farm, and they also did not use oxen, which was common at the time because, again, they did not want to harm the animals. So they were doing all the plowing themselves by hand and all this sort of thing. But they weren't really farmers. They were educators, they were intellectuals. And so things like the crops coming in, they would be off lecturing about transcendentalism. And in fact, Bronson Alcott would kind of forget about the crops coming in. And so his wife and children would be trying to get the crops in and this sort of thing. They also didn't plan on Massachusetts in the winter. It gets really cold and like snow, and they were unprepared for all of that. And also because they were transcendentalists and they believed that everyone's individuality was hugely important, it was really hard to make rules to kind of govern this society. And so everyone was expressing themselves and doing their own thing, which was really lovely on some level, but problematic in others. For example, there was one guy there that his individual calling was to just shout out swear words a lot, like that was his thing. And other people found that problematic, right? So it was confusing to try to figure out. Ultimately, it was not a success. So that I think the winter is really what did them in. And so ultimately, the whole thing just completely failed. And then he just was so upset and devastated at really the death of his dream, that he kind of just became very depressed, literally took to his bed. And so his wife had to borrow money from her brother to get them somewhere to live, to get out of there. And the whole thing was a dismal failure at the time. But now we can look at it as an attempt to do a lot of things that we now accept as norms that were just not norms at the time. He was very ahead of his time. So, but meanwhile, Melville was well aware of this Fruitlands experiment. And so, can you live out that individual calling and be successful? And will you be supported by others in society in that? Because Bronson Alcott was pretty much ridiculed for the whole experiment. So, can you just do that and be supported by society? Can you do your own thing? Or are you in some way forced to conform? So you get to decide. I don't think there's a clear cut answer, but I do think he's playing with that throughout the story. So let's look now at the questions and think of those if on that deeper level. So so do remember that you are being quizzed on the story, not the movie. I hope the movie was helpful. There are three versions that I know of this story. This one is 2001. There were two made in 1970. One's a British one and one's an American one. They're both really good. So if you get the chance to check either of those out, they are on the internet. They're both really good, and they have different, things that are really good about them, but this is my favorite. However, they just know that you are not being quizzed on the movie, you're being quizzed on the story. So you do need the correct names of the characters in the story. Like there's no Ernie or Rocky, for example, in the actual story, right? They did change their names. They also changed, of course, the Vivian character is not Vivian. In fact, she's a 12-year-old named Gingernet, right? So we don't have 12-year-olds working in offices today. But at the time, that was considered to be like more of an internship. That would have been a great opportunity. So, times change, right? So I think they needed to make some concession to today's society, but there are so many lines taken straight from the text in that movie. So at any rate, all right. So number one, what is the phrase that Bartleby uses? In what ways does this phrase disrupt the office? You've got to know the phrase. You can't read anything of the story and not know the phrase, right? I will let you look that up. But it is important to know the exact phrase that he said and exactly how did this phrase disrupt the office, okay? Next, name and describe the characters in the story. Be sure to include their behavior in the office in your description. So again, you've got to know the names of the characters in the story, not the movie, right? So you should know that. And the boss does not have a name. That's interesting, isn't it? But so you can't. So if you're like, what's his name? What's his name? He's not named. So you can call him the boss. You can call him the narrator. You could call him the lawyer. But we do not. Of course, he has a name, I guess, but we're not given that name. But you should know him and his behavior in the story. You should know the coworkers in the office and their behavior in the story. So note they're all a little quirky, and the office was putting up with all this quirky behavior of the employees, but until Bartleby comes, it sort of works, right? And so just kind of keep that in mind. But you should know their specific behavior in the office, what's unique to them, and their name from the story. All right, number 3. How well did the boss/lawyer handle the situation with Bartleby? Remember to give evidence to support your answer. So you might think, well, he handled it pretty well, considering that not too many people would be in this predicament, right? Of somebody preferring not to and all that, right? And so you might say, well, he really handled it pretty well. And that's fine. So then you just need to give evidence, give an example of how he handled that well, where he handled that well, etc. Or you might think, no, he did not handle this well at all. He needed to cut this situation off before it went too far, right? So maybe he should have, fired him right away when he started not doing the work, right? So, but then you need to give a specific example of that. So yes, you might need a quote, you might need some lines, that kind of thing, or describe the situation. All right, so you might be somewhere in the middle. You might even be able to say, in some ways he handled it pretty well. It is a unique situation. He tried to be understanding. He tried to be compassionate, and a good thing to have in a boss, really, but maybe there needed to be some boundaries there, or something like that. Or you might say, I understand he was really trying to be nice, but he really needed to cut this behavior off, or something. So that's all fine, but you need evidence. Whatever your view is, you get to have any really reasonable opinion. Reasonable, I mean, it has to be about the story. But you get to have your opinion, which is great, but you've got to support it with evidence from the story, not the movie. All right, so let's move on. Then, number 4, in what way could this story explore the concept of the individual versus society? So, exactly what I was saying, um, you're going to explain how does this story explore that concept of, can you be an individual in our society then or now? How did, I think it still works, right? How can you be, how far can you take being your own unique self, right? Can you just really do that? And if you can do that, that's awesome. And how, right? How, within the context of the story, does the story show that you can in fact be an individual, or how does it show that you can't? So you might say, well, actually, I think it shows you can, because he went pretty far, that he really preferred not to throughout the story, and really he didn't do a lot of work most of the time, right? So that you could, kind of do your own thing, show up to work, and I prefer not to actually do the work here, but I'm still here, right? I mean, you could make that argument. You could also make the argument that he couldn't, and he really couldn't be himself. You could make the argument that there's a point when he says, when the boss is asking him, why aren't you working? And he says, can't you see the reason for yourself? And so perhaps this is another way to analyze the story, that, well, you could say, let me step back. You could say that he's saying, look, I can't be myself in this confining environment. And, like, there's just too many ways I have to conform and not be myself. Can't you see that? It's pointless. You could also look at this as a critique of capitalism. People have often looked at the story, it says a story of Wall Street, right? So you could look at it as a critique of capitalism and the capitalist society, that you could look at that people just sort of have to kind of conform to these norms in order to just keep their head above water and that sort of thing. And maybe that's what he's saying when he says, can't you see the reason for yourself? Like, this is pointless. We're all just going through the motions. We're not doing anything significant here. We're just making copies. So just note that's important too. They are making copies. That's what they do in this job, right? They're human copy machines, right? So they're making copies. They're doing nothing original. It seems pointless to him, right? Of course, it's work that needs to be done, one could argue, right? So you get to explore these ideas, but you just need to explain your idea clearly, and then you need evidence from the text that supports that. All right, number 5. What is significant about the fact that the office workers are copiers, that they are making their living making copies, which I just touched on? So again, they're not doing anything original. They are making copies. What is it about that? I want you to say a little bit more than I just said and give an example to support that. All right, so example from the text. Number 6, how does the lawyer's belief that the easiest way of life is best impact the story? What specifically does he mean by this phrase? So he says the easiest way of life is best in the beginning of the story, right? So he's a lawyer that's never been to trial. So, he doesn't seem to like conflict. We know that about him. How does that impact the story? I mean, you could say that, he's continually backing away from conflict, right? So he's continually, like, when he tries to really cut down on, Bartleby's behavior, or, really get him to really, get in there and do the work or whatever, he always ends up backing off, right? So you could say that he believes the easiest way is best, like not to get in all this conflict, but that on the other hand, it ends up causing him a great deal of problems. Like, he has to move his entire office to get away from Bartleby, right? So was it really so easy, or was it not really that easy, the easiest way of life? So you get to decide, but you need evidence, right? So how does the lawyer's belief that the easiest way of life is best impact the story? And then what specifically does he mean by the phrase? And then you need evidence to support your answer. All right. What do the frequent references to walls and partitions in the story represent? So There are a lot of frequent references to walls and partitions. Bartleby's behind a screen, right? And there are all these references to that. What does that mean? So again, you're thinking deeper, right? So you're thinking more deeply about this story. What are we walled off from, right? What are we being barricaded from, right? Think about that, and the idea of being an individual and all of that, right? Think about that, and then answer the question, what do you think they represent, and give evidence, given a specific circumstance perhaps of one of those walls or partitions and what that could mean. All right, next, 8, explain the significance of Bartleby's previous job that he had before this one, being in the dead letter office of the post office. So what do you think? What's the significance of that? What's the significance of this, of his being like is Bartleby like a dead letter in some ways, or what? So my understanding is that the dead letter office of the post office actually exists. I think it still exists, and it is a place where the address isn't correct. They can't deliver it. They can't send it to the return address, like that's missing or incorrect or something. And so then they basically, I think the letters have to be destroyed. So, but what I had found out, this here's a little tidbit, right? I had a student in class years ago that she was retired from the post office, and she was saying that she really connected with this idea of the dead letter office, because she said that in her career at the post office, there was a certain time that she had been assigned to the dead letter office, and while in the dead letter office, she became clinically depressed. And she found the environment of the dead letter office was very depressing. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting considering the story. And then, totally different class. We weren't reading the story, but I had another student who was also retired from the post office. So I had to ask him, I had to tell him about the story and ask him, about the dead letter office. And he said, that's true. He said that he was a supervisor, and he had so many people that had been assigned to the dead letter office that became clinically depressed, and he would have to write, some paperwork for them to go get counseling and things like that, because it was such a common issue. And I thought, whoa, that's so interesting. So what is it about that dead letter office, right? So you could think about that too. You could think, and that's something you could consider the story with too. Does Bartleby have some issue like depression or something like that it would not be treated at the time, because they remember, like, Freud was like the father of modern psychology, and he was 20th century. This was 19th century, right? So there was not counseling at the time. There was not medication of this sort for issues of mental health. So if Bartleby was clinically depressed, what was he going to do about that exactly? There really wasn't a lot he could do. So just kind of consider that too. And Melville may not have made that meant that. Who knows? But the human issues existed. We had the same type of things happen to people. It's just that there weren't as many resources discovered yet at that time. So, think about that. There's any number of mental health issues, emotional issues that he might have experienced. Also think about in your final paper, you're going to be writing about an issue of one of these stories, and that is something that it would be interesting to explore in a final paper. All right, enough about that. Let's go on to the next one, and it says, number 9, why do you think that Bartleby prefers not to? There's a clue to number 1 question, right? Explain and use evidence from the story to support your idea. Why does he say, I prefer not to? So notice that he doesn't say, I'm not doing it. I don't care what you tell me. I'm just not doing it. No, he's so polite. That's part of the problem, really. He is so polite when he says, I prefer not to. And that is what puzzles people. That's what people go, oh, okay. Okay, I guess, So think about that. Think about that, I prefer not to. Why does he say it that way? So also, now let's go back to thinking about the Transcendentalist and Henry David Thoreau and his not paying taxes and ending up going to jail for that. When he did that, he went to jail willingly. He didn't fight off anybody. He did it very politely. He just, he didn't really go have a riot or anything. He very politely refused to pay his taxes, and he politely went to jail and served his time until he politely went out, right? but it made an impression. And now we think of this as being one of the first instances of passive resistance. And Thoreau's actions actually inspired a lot of the passive resistance movements that were really going on in the 1960s for the civil rights movement. So this, though we don't know, not too many folks would call themselves a transcendentalist today. What they did has affected us in many ways. But so think about this idea that he preferred not to. He said, I prefer not to. And at one point, the boss asked him, you will not? And he said, I prefer not. So that brings us to, I will post the assignment for this. It's my favorite extra credit assignment. I'm just going to tell you about it now. So when you see the assignment, you'll go, oh yeah, she talked about that in the video. That this extra credit assignment will be for you to, if you decide to take this on, for you to try out the phrase, I prefer not to. Try it out in some situation in your life and write about it. So write about a page about what happened. Who did you use the phrase with? Where did you use the phrase? How did it feel using that phrase? Was it empowering? Was it scary? What was their reaction to that? How did the situation work out? So I started doing this extra credit assignment because one semester in reading the story and discussing it, spontaneously, students started telling me that they were using the phrase in their lives and were having all these different outcomes from it. So I thought, ooh, that is super cool. So I wanted to do it as an experiment. So use it judiciously. If you're I probably wouldn't use it at work. I mean, don't get yourself fired or something like that. Please, no. I say that. Please use caution, right? But use it in your life and see if you choose. It's extra credit because you don't have to do this. But if you choose, it's worth 20 points extra credit. So that could be a boost to you if you decide to use it. So again, I'll post the assignment, but you need to write about a page after you do this about using the phrase I prefer not to, just a one-page response, who you used it with, how you used it, what happened, what was the situation, how it made you feel, would you do it again, right? All right, so that's that. But then, so number 9. Number 10, what does the end of the story signify? Explain the ending and what you think this means for the overall story and what point Melville may be making. So notice that in the end of the story is slightly different from the movie, right? So if you were considered to be a vagrant, you could actually go to jail and have to be in jail for that, right? So that is not true today. So that is why they needed to change that, right, in the movie. But tragic ending, right? So it's a really tragic ending. Things don't work out too well for our character here, right? So what does that signify? I'm trying not to tell you the ending, so in case you haven't finished reading it, right? But it's really important to know that how it ends in the story, right? And how does it end, right? And what do you think that means for? I mean, how does for Melva's overall meaning of the story? Why do you think it ends this way? And be specific. Again, use details from the story to support your answer. I mean, what is Melville saying? Can you be an individual, or can you be an individual, but you can take it to a certain degree? But ultimately, there are ways that we have to conform. And you might even argue there are ways that we have to conform to move society forward, right? That, like, for example, with Fruitlands, that there was too much individuality and they couldn't coalesce to come together to make this society work even through the winter, basically, right? But you could also argue that we're hampered by having no support to try to be an individual. You could argue that we're sort of hemmed in on every side and really so urged to conform that it shuts people down. I mean, so you could argue that too. I mean, so you get to make up your mind. There's no right answer as far as your opinion. You get to have your opinion as long as it's based on the story and not, you understand the story. But you get to decide your view about it, but then you do need to have evidence to back that up from the story. So that is the study guide. The 4 questions on the quiz will come directly from the study guide. The bonus question may come from the study guide. It may also come from a more closer reading of the story, and it could also come from something about the author. So you might want to read over that bio about Melville. And it could even, well, I don't think I'm going to do that. I was going to say it could come from this lecture, but that just seems that seems too much and too quick. So it'll either come from the bonus question will either be from the story or information about Herman Melville. All right, so I hope that this has helped to just give you a little more insight on Bartleby the Scrivener and a little more insight into Herman Melville and the context of what was going on in the country at the time and how those events and particularly this group of folks known as the Transcendentalists, how that may have informed the writing of the story. All right.